70-year-old Edna Phillips lived a quiet and secluded life with her white terrier, Chum, on the Penywaun estate in South Wales. Unfortunately, this estate had become increasingly dangerous as unemployment rates rose, leading to higher levels of crime. Miss Phillips herself became the target of abuse after she complained about a family on the estate. She was verbally abused, rubbish was dumped in her garden, she had stones thrown at her, and faeces were smeared on her house. Despite all of this evidence to support her request to be moved off of the estate, the council failed to do so. The abuse would peak on the 16th of July 1992, when Miss Phillips was attacked in her own home. She was tortured and murdered in the most brutal and vicious of ways. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 17 of the Student's Verdict podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. To all our new listeners, hello, my name is Emily and I'm your host. If you haven't already, please go and listen to some of our earlier episodes, which cover cases such as that of Harry Potter actor Rob Knox and the Toolbox Killers. Please follow us on Instagram at the Student Verdict Pod and on Twitter at Student Verdict. We also have a Facebook page and a Facebook group. Find links to all our social media in the show notes. If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a review. If you don't like the show, then please keep your comments to yourself. As always, resources used in this episode will always be linked in the show notes. A quick content warning: today's episode contains graphic details of violence and murder and is not suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is therefore strongly advised. A quick reminder that the Student's Verdict now has merchandise, which I'm super excited about. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, sweatshirts in a variety of colours, and they all feature the new logo design, perfect for this autumn-winter season. I've included a link in the show notes if you'd like to check it out. If you do buy anything, please tweet me a picture at Student Verdict, tag me on Instagram at the Student Verdict Pod, and on the Student's Verdict Facebook page. The final thing to say is we are now on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show, there are tiers ranging from £3 up to £20 a month. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the show notes. Each tier comes with a variety of perks, so please check it out. Any support is hugely appreciated. With all of that said, let's jump into today's episode. You are going to have to forgive me for my pronunciation of some of these Welsh places today. I did my best to research how to pronounce some of these names, but some I just couldn't find, and so you're going to have to forgive me. I'm sorry if I butcher them. Our story today takes us to the Penywaun Council estate in the Cynon Valley in South Wales. In the 2011 census, the population was registered as 3,063. This estate had become increasingly dangerous due to economic pressures, a rise in unemployment, and a lack of police presence. We'll be talking about this more later in the episode. 70-year-old Edna Phillips had never married and spent much of her life looking after her parents. She was later described by a close friend as, quote, a frail spinster, Edna Phillips would never hurt a fly. She had lived on the estate for many years in a 2-bedroomed, semi-detached house, a house which she always kept very neat and tidy. Over the years, she had seen many people come and go. One day, her next-door neighbours, the Rossi family, moved in. They had a daughter, Maria, who was just a toddler at that time. It was said that Miss Phillips would sometimes take little Maria for walks. Unfortunately, the relationship between Miss Phillips and the Rossis started to splinter as Maria got older. Miss Phillips began lodging complaints against the family for antisocial behaviour such as loud music and drunken behaviour. the complaints led the Rossis to despise her. Out of retaliation for the complaints Edna Phillips lodged, Maria began a campaign of abuse against the elderly woman. Maria would throw rubbish in her garden and would throw stones at Edna. She screamed names at her in the street and even smeared faeces on Miss Phillips's house. These, along with other acts of vandalism and theft, caused Miss Phillips to contact the council in 1987, requesting that she be moved to another house, but her request was not granted. I assume that Edna didn't have any family. None are ever mentioned, and I don't know anyone who would allow their elderly relative to be harassed like this. So in 1992, after Maria burgled Miss Phillips's house, Miss Phillips was at her wits' end. She wrote to her MP, Anne Cloud, explaining how desperate her situation was. As a result of this, the police put her in touch with victim services. Police also installed a burglar alarm in Miss Phillips's house. After this, the Deputy Divisional Commander wrote to the MP, Anne Cloud, explaining that, quote, all matters raised within the letter had been satisfactorily addressed. Miss Phillips might beg to differ. On the 16th of July, 1992, Edna was walking her dog when she exchanged words with the 17-year-old Maria Rossi about her younger sister. Edna Phillips returned to her house at about 10:45, leaving her white terrier Chum outside. Later, she called out for Chum to come back into the house. As she did so, Maria Rossi and her 17-year-old friend Christina Malloy, who also went by Tina, saw her. By this time, Edna was 70 years old and was partially sighted. The pair, with alcohol and temazepam coursing through their veins, forced Edna Phillips back into her home. The story is going to get graphic now. You've been warned. Rossi and Malloy began their attack by using a dog chain to strangle Edna before slashing her in the face 35 times with a utility knife, a pair of scissors, and a piece of broken glass. Rossi and Malloy then stabbed the 70-year-old 86 times and stamped on her chest, breaking 5 ribs and her nose. They humiliated her by breaking eggs over her body, and in their final act of depravity, they attempted to scalp her. This is the dictionary definition of overkill. Edna was an elderly woman who didn't have the best eyesight. I doubt she would have put up much of a fight, and so to keep attacking her in such a brutal way speaks to her killer's depravity. As for the scalping, when you search the term, it's suggested that scalping generally occurs or used to occur during warfare, and the scalp was regarded as a trophy, which would be kept and displayed. This wasn't warfare. This wasn't even a fair fight, which begs the question, why? Why did 2 17-year-olds commit such acts of brutality? Before the girls fled, they stole Edna's vacuum cleaner, her radio, and her pension money, which was about £57.15. When police found the body of Edna Phillips, they were horrified. Sergeant Gareth Jones, one of the investigating officers, recalled some years later, quote, "The murder was horrific. The injuries you couldn't describe. Couple that scene to 2 teenage girls, I couldn't take it in. She was strangled with the dog chain and then attacked with 3 horrendous implements, a Stanley knife, scissors, and sliver of thick glass, to the point where her face was taken away. She must have suffered horrendously. It doesn't bear thinking about. This was a clean-living, warm lady. She was independent. She was murdered in her own home for being an unwanted neighbour." The culprits were arrested within 48 hours. It was reported that by this point, Maria Rossi had told her family what she'd done, and even sang "We've Killed Edna" and "Ding Dong, Edna's Dead" to the tune of The Wizard of Oz. When news of the horrendous crime broke, the community went through various emotions, first horror and shock, and then those feelings turned to anger. It was reported in one newspaper from the 10th of March 1993 that after the murder was discovered, a crowd of approximately 300 people, including women and children, descended. The reporter described how Linda Rossi, Maria's mother, was shouting defiance from an upstairs window as her house was pelted with rocks by the crowd. Linda's mother, so Maria's grandmother, who had been a resident of the estate for 25 years, had to be removed from her home as a mob began attacking it. Grandma Rossi's greenhouse, which was tended by her 82-year-old husband, was wrecked. The plants were uprooted, and the word murderer was painted on the house. Christina Malloy's parents, who were newcomers to the estate, also had to be removed from their homes. It wasn't just the immediate families who were attacked. An attempt was made to firebomb Ali's General Store because an employee at the store was a distant relative of the Rossis. One poor hairdresser had to be taken out of the area just because she had the same surname, Rossi. She was not actually related to the Rossi family in this story at all. The Irish Independent published an article on the 18th of March 1993. In it, the newspaper described how the moods of the British people were bleak after a series of particularly brutal murders. So not only Edna's case, but around this time you also had the case of James Bulger, as I'm sure many of you know. The newspaper stated that after the death of Edna Phillips, the mob was looking for revenge. But the newspaper questioned where these people were when Miss Phillips's windows were broken and her house was smeared with dog excrement. Quote, "Anger is easier and cheaper after the event." In the article, they concluded that you can't solve a problem by behaving like that problem. Violence doesn't solve violence. We're going to take a quick break so that I can play you a trailer for a podcast that I think you're going to absolutely love. She's already hugely popular, and that is Paige from Reverie True Crime. Please give her podcast a listen. I cannot recommend her enough. I will leave links to her in the show notes. Give her a listen, leave her a glowing review, and subscribe to her. And I hope you enjoy.
My name is Paige, and I'm the host of Reverie True Crime. Reverie means to daydream, but even daydreams can become nightmares. Come join me and get lost in horrific reverie about true crimes and eerie events. Reverie True Crime Podcast, available wherever you stream your favorite podcasts.
So let's talk about the estate that Edna Phillips, the Rossis, and the Malloys lived on, because I think it's really important. I am going to get this name wrong over and over again, so let's just let it be. The economic problems in Penywaun had deepened after the miners' strike, which led to the closure of pits. Some believed that the closure of these pits was a political act aimed at punishing the miners' union. The police station in Penywaun was unfortunately boarded up and falling apart. It had been shut some 10 years prior, and the estate had lost its resident policeman, which doesn't exactly instill confidence in the community. It was said that burglaries committed by quote-unquote problem families were common, and everybody knew who these culprits were. Some, like Edna Phillips, lodged formal complaints, but very little seemed to be done. One resident, Robert Lloyd, recalled how when he and his wife Lisa moved into one particularly notorious part of the estate, they were burgled twice in a week, saying, quote, "We had to move all the electrical goods out, and lock them in a garage. The wife had to live at her mother's and I moved to mine. We only got another house because we told the council we'd split up. He went on to say, quote, everyone who's doing the stealing, none of them have cars. They just carry the stuff through the streets. One of the families had a daughter that set fire to the comprehensive school when I was in Form 3. They had a son, only 7, who broke into the nursery school, stamped on the hamster, and they still let him back in. The same family took a little girl down the river, stripped her off, and threw her in. End quote. It's clear that in this area there are a number of contributory factors that gave the Penywaun estate its reputation. The high crime rates are a result of the lack of police presence on the estate. That, coupled with the high unemployment rates, meant that many people would have had to resort to stealing to meet their needs. Robert Lloyd explained, quote, job prospects are zilch. I've got to go to this stupid job club in Aberdeen, look through the newspapers, have a cup of tea. If I don't go, they'll take my benefit. I've got an application in for a railway guard, but nothing's going to come out of it. You look in the job centre and you can tell the money's low because they all say wages negotiable. To try and combat the struggles faced by the unemployed, they had developed survival tactics. One of them was known as hobbling. This was where men in receipt of benefits would sign up with building subcontractors. They'd get £20 a day, and the subcontractors would then bill the main contractor for a full wage. Robert Lloyd went on, quote, 90% of the families are respectable here, but there's a lot I know who claim single-parent benefit, who shouldn't because they still live together. If you're separated, the woman gets £20 a week extra, so the bloke gets £40 and she'll be on about £75. I get £150 a fortnight. It's that low because I had a loan from Social Security for another cooker at Christmas, so that's £10 a week off. Then there's £5 for the water, £5 for the poll tax. My payday's tomorrow, and when I've paid back what I've borrowed, I'll be borrowing again on Monday from parents and relatives. End quote. Adrian Creedy told reporters that he heard the crowd outside the Malloys, the sound of breaking glass and applause. He told reporters, quote, youngsters today have nothing to do, nowhere to go all night, so they're down in Aberdeen shoplifting. On Mondays, you'll see them in school uniform. Saturday nights, they'll be drinking or injecting cider into their veins. Respect for elders has gone out of the community. I had to do a double take when I first read that. They were injecting cider into their veins, presumably so it got into their bloodstream quicker. It seems as though this community, like so many others, had its own way of doing things, its own rules. These rules might not always make sense, but in this case, Edna's murder went against those rules, and the people wanted to take their revenge. But it should never have got to that point. It was reported that Maria Rossi had had dreams of leaving the Welsh valleys and becoming a fashion model. Instead, she stood in the dock at Cardiff Crown Court and pleaded guilty to the murder of Edna Phillips, as did her co-defendant Christina Malloy. And on the 8th of March 1993, they appeared for sentencing. The prosecutor, John Rees QC, told the court how the teenagers had butchered Miss Phillips, and when sentencing, Judge Scott Baker branded the pair, quote, evil products of the modern age. He went on to say, quote, no one can be other than sickened at hearing the circumstances in which you mutilated and killed a defenseless old lady who had caused no harm to anyone. If as youngsters some discipline had been imposed upon you at home, in school, or through the courts, you might not now be standing in the dock. In one newspaper, the Evening Sentinel, they had a column where I think readers could post their own opinions about various topics. On the 12th of March 1993, a woman by the name of Virginia Heath shared her opinion about the murderers of Edna Phillips. Quote, "The female torturers who throttled, stabbed, and slashed frail pensioner Edna Phillips deserve every hour of every day of their open-ended detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. We can hope that it'll be many years before either of her killers, Maria Rossi and Christina Malloy, are allowed back into society. Let's be truthful, such was the depravity of their butchery, that most ordinary folk would far prefer them to remain locked up forever and the keys conveniently lost. I truly doubt that the girls bred in this cesspit of life in the 90s will have any conscience about mutilating the partially blind pensioner." Virginia Heath went on, quote, "Above all that, a vital factor which struck me was the blatant evasion of parental responsibility for the girls. One father said, 'Drink and drugs were too easily available and have ruined our family.' Any intelligent, law-abiding, responsible parent would surely have been suicidal at his daughter facing a murder rap. But no, he chose to blame it on the availability of drinks and drugs, not on the failure of himself and the girl's mother to show decent moral standards. The parents of the two murderers and other violent young people should be made to appear in the dock alongside them." End quote. Virginia Heath was critical of the protection afforded to the murderers' families, stating that Edna Phillips had not been provided such protection or a means of escape. Maria Rossi and Christina Malloy were both given indefinite sentences with a minimum term of 15 years. In April 1999, Rossi's sentence was reduced by the then Home Secretary Jack Straw from 15 years to 13, and Malloy's sentence was reduced to 12. A few years later, this case began making headlines again. Maria Rossi and Anthony Dudson, who was 16 when he participated in the murder of Suzanne Capper in December 1992, brought a case before the High Court, who ruled that the Home Secretary must regularly review all sentences of those in prison for murders committed when they were juveniles. In 2004, the Master of the Rolls, Lord Phillips, affirmed this ruling. He criticised how the legal system had dealt with child murderers. He urged Parliament to review and reform the law so it was more in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which states that imprisoning children must only be a measure of last resort, and custody should be for the shortest appropriate period. This decision means that the cases of around 200 juvenile murderers must be periodically reviewed. Maria Rossi, who has changed her name to Maria Smith, was released from prison in 2010. There's no further information about what happened to her, which leads me to believe that she therefore lives among us, although it was made very, very clear that she would never be welcome in Penywaun ever again. As for Christina Malloy, on the 1st of May 2017, she was found dead at her home in Fenstanton, Cambridgeshire. She was just 42 years old. At the inquest into her death, held at Lawrence Court in Huntingdon, it was revealed that Christina Malloy too had changed her name to Martina O'Toole and had been living in Cambridgeshire with her two children. Speaking at her inquest, her partner, Richard Nicholson, explained he had met Miss O'Toole at the Pig and Falcon pub in St. Neots about 8.5 years before her death. Talking about their relationship, Mr. Nicholson said, quote, "My relationship with Martina has been a very good one. We have had, as with every relationship, our disagreements. We mainly argued when drinking got to the excessive stages. Martina has developed a problem with alcohol over the time I have known her. I didn't really notice when she lived in St. Neots, but since living in Fenstanton, she said she felt quite isolated." End quote. He went on to explain that she had suffered with depression and anxiety and self-medicated with alcohol. I know that in the time during the run-up to her conviction for murder, when she was 17, she had been moved from London, where she lived, to Wales. I think this may have triggered those feelings in her. I know that she said she had a problem with drugs and alcohol before the conviction, but since I've been with her, I have never seen her take any drugs apart from cocodamol, which she took for her back pain. Mr. Nicholson went on to explain that Martina, or Christina Malloy as we know her, had attended a support group for her drinking, and she had read a book about how to give up alcohol, but he suspected she had continued drinking. Before she died, Christina had been coughing and vomiting intermittently for approximately 2 days before she died. Because of how ill she was, Richard was sleeping downstairs. Richard checked on Christina at around 1:30 a.m. on the day she died. She asked if she could have some milk and ice. Richard recalled that her speech was slurred, as she promised this would be the last time, but he'd heard that before. At 7:30 a.m., Richard checked on Christina again. This time, he found her on the floor with her head propped up against the bedroom cabinet. As her chin rested on her chest, she was going blue and purple. Richard called 999 and attempted chest compressions whilst waiting for the ambulance. Christina Malloy, or Martina O'Toole, was declared dead at 8:31 a.m. on the 1st of May 2017. The coroner, Miss Skinner, summarised Dr. Benjamin Swift's report. As he conducted his post-mortem, Dr. Swift noted that Christina had an alcohol concentration of less than 10 milligrams per 100 millilitres in both her blood and vitreous humour at the time of her death, and she had no drugs in her system. Dr. Swift concluded, quote, "The cause of Martina O'Toole's death has not been established though. Having excluded a traumatic or toxicological cause, it is more likely than not to have occurred through natural causes. It is known that individuals with a history of alcoholism have an increased risk of sudden, unexpected death." Ms. Skinner accepted the cause of death as unascertained and concluded that Miss O'Toole had died of natural causes. After the hearing, a neighbour said the following about Christina Malloy, or Martina O'Toole as they knew her. "I have nothing bad to say about her. She was a quiet, gentle person, very polite, just generally a nice sort of lady, but we were obviously concerned about her drinking. We didn't know about what she had done until after she died. That one error, and she was never able to get over it. Whether any of us could have helped her, I don't know." What's sad about this story is that everyone in this story needed help in some way. The estate needed help with the crime and unemployment rates, which obviously go hand in hand and were spiraling out of control. They were a community who had been largely left to their own devices, following the rules that they chose to follow without fear of punishment. Edna Phillips, a vulnerable member of that community, needed help, and even went as far as to ask for it, but that help never really came. That mob that came to avenge her death came too late. Christina Malloy needed help. How did she even become involved in this crime? She had no issue with Edna Phillips herself and could have picked a very different path in life. When it comes to Maria Rossi, I'd like to know your thoughts. As we heard before, some held her parents equally responsible for the murder of Edna Phillips. In this particular case, do you agree? Let me know your thoughts on Twitter @StudentVerdict. And that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. The Student's Verdict is a bi-weekly podcast, so follow us on social media to hear about our next episode. The Student's Verdict can be found anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spreaker, YouTube, and iHeartRadio. See you on the next one, and remember to keep living the dream.